Thanks very much, Pernilla, and thank you for joining us in this lunchtime discussion. I think we have a lot of things to reflect on. I myself will reflect a little bit on the experience that I've been doing of working with indigenous peoples primarily, but also local communities in terms of our engagement with global processes and linking different types of knowledge systems, right? First, I'm Ibaloy Igorot, this people in the north of the Philippines, in the Cordillera Philippines. And throughout my work, I've maintained very close ties with my community and the organizations there, because I think this has helped to ground the work that I do at the global level. Because currently I'm a policy advisor with the Forest Peoples Program. That's an international human rights NGO, and we work with a lot of partners, mainly in tropical forest countries. We work with forest peoples, right? Now, in the course of this work that I've been doing, I've been engaged in a number of global policy processes. And I'll just mention a few. For example, when I was working with the International Alliance of Indigenous Peoples of the Tropical Forest, we were engaged in the criteria and indicators for sustainable forest management. And then I was a commissioner with the World Commission on Dams, and we looked at the development effectiveness of large dams. And a similar exercise was done with the World Bank on its extractive industries review. And then on work on indicators relevant for indigenous peoples, we started work on the Millennium Development Goals. How do you really look at poverty in relation to indigenous peoples? And that work has carried on with the current Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, in the CBD itself, it had the 2010 biodiversity target to reduce the rate of biodiversity loss. And currently, it has its strategic plan for biodiversity 2011 to 2020. And now, in the IPBES, of course, there's the global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services for human well-being. And of course, we're also trying to engage that process. So, actually, this, in reflecting on this work, how do I actually perceive my role? I actually perceive my role as an indigenous rights activist. In more policy-oriented terms, I'm a policy advocate or a policy advisor on these types of issues. But really what I'm attempting is to get a greater recognition and respect for indigenous people's rights in these global themes, which are basically intergovernmental negotiations on environment and development, because they're also shaping how governments think about these themes, and they also influence a lot how they do programming and projects and law in our countries, right? So in fact, these are deliberative processes. Their discourse gets developed, and then out of which decisions come out. So there's a big question here. What do these big issues actually mean for indigenous peoples, at least those that I have been working with, yeah? And also, what have been the impacts of such global policy on the peoples, particularly in communities? But how can we actually make these processes relevant through effective participation of indigenous peoples and communities, so that they can not only give contributions, but perhaps reform and even transform some of these discourse and decisions, so that they become meaningful basically from local to global, because these are different global arenas, right? So some of the questions I have asked of myself is, how can I ensure the groundedness of my policy work in the realities of communities that you're supposed to be speaking for and with, yeah? how does it really support the agency and voice of indigenous peoples in global policy discourse and deliberations, right? And how do these decisions then become tools also for communities to assert and exercise their rights and self-determination, because they're well informed about how these themes have been playing out in both intergovernmental negotiations but also in country thinking. So related to that, I will talk about some of the methodologies and tools that we have sort of trialed and worked out to enhance this type of engagement, right? Okay, so, and maybe the best way to talk about this is just to look at the quite specific examples of engagements and how they have actually worked, right? Now, I'll start with the World Commission on Dams that examine the development effectiveness of large dams. This was actually a big study. It involved governments, the business sector, civil society, scientists, and it was really to see what has been the experience with large dams. I was actually there supposedly in my own expert capacity for indigenous peoples, because in my work in the Philippines, I was engaged in a large-scale campaign that actually successfully stopped 4 dams in the Philippines that were being funded by the World Bank, because one, it was unacceptable really to the population, but if you look deeply into its actual plan, impact assessment, etc., it would have been quite disastrous for that entire mountain area. How did we actually approach this, right? So actually working also with the Forest Peoples Program at that time, we tried to muster the evidence on what was really happening to indigenous peoples as a result of these large dams, right? So we had the communities themselves writing their experiences, and we mustered a big global workshop where people presented what their experiences were, and then we did summing up and synthesis of what were the key issues related to large dams, right? And I'm glad to say that in that process, one of the messages that came out from these multi-stakeholder commissioners, right, we were 12 commissioners, was that with respect to water and energy projects, there are rights holders whose rights have to be respected. There are also other actors, other interested parties who have also interests and stakes in that process. So we actually unpacked what is the meaning of these multi-stakeholders, because it's constantly used, right? And in the case of the large dams, we said, well, in the case of large dams, there are certain rights holders. They were there, they have water rights, they have land rights, etc. And those have to be respected in the development process. Now, there are other interested actors, investors, governments have water and energy projects, etc. And I'm glad that that was affirmed. There are certain basic principles and rights that in a multi-stakeholder process cannot just be negotiated away. Sometimes we easily use the word trade-off and things like that, right? But it's actually necessary to understand certain basic principles and rights that have to be respected in that process, right? So we talked, for example, of rights holders and risks to those rights, And those were some of the things that needed to be addressed in making water and policy and energy decisions. The other thing that was interesting was that who is the body that will make a final judgment about development effectiveness? You know, will it be the government? Will it be who, right? And we decided, well, it's one of the things that we put on the table, was that development effectiveness has to be decided by the actors themselves who are engaged in that water and energy development. Yeah, because they put their interests on the table, certain impacts will happen. And finally, what actually is delivered and what are the outcomes will have to be judged by those affected rights holders and actors. So we said very much that development effectiveness is not something objective, that it actually involves the negotiation and understanding of those who are part of that entire process. And that has started to inform me in a lot of my other work. Because, for example, whether you're talking about development or well-being, you can have as many definitions and understandings of these words, depending on who are the distinct indigenous peoples involved. So you can have very multiple understandings of these words. And it is actually necessary to understand that diversity and to bring that diversity into the conversation in order to have a fuller understanding of these terms, which are just, you know, say government has an understanding of development, and so would other folks, right? So this was the same approach that was brought into the extractive industries review of the World Bank, where it looked at its investments in mining and other extractive industries. And how then will you judge whether that investment is a good investment? So again, who decides as to whether or not that is a good investment, right? But this issue of directly listening to the voices and deep research, actually, because you cannot really convince a global review without detailed, good evidence, through case studies by the peoples themselves, and then them coming and presenting that evidence, I think continues to be a very valid way of mobilizing knowledge for these types of larger processes. So indeed, that is linking the local experience, the impacts within the country, but also with a global review of something, right? So in fact, there is another area of work that I've been involved in. This is indicators relevant for indigenous peoples. Because when the Millennium Development Goals were being discussed, a number of statements started coming out that why is it that indigenous peoples seem to have been excluded from the Millennium Development Goals? Yeah, in the planning of countries, there was an invisibility of certain groups, particularly when they started using these definitions of $1 a day as the definition of poverty. So they defined certain groups as living on having $1 a day. I don't know how they found that information anyway. And that was their definition of poverty. However, when we were talking to groups, for example, in Indonesia, right? These were the Dayak. They said, no, we don't define poverty in that way, yeah? We define poverty as bounded by certain things that strengthen our community. And this was actually customary law. They're customary. And they said poverty for us is when those laws are disregarded and things fall into chaos. You know, the community is no longer able to relate to a certain order or a certain values, and that is when poverty comes in, because we have lost almost our, you know, our meaning. Yeah, and that was how they were divided. So I think, really, how can we be talking about this $1 a day definition of poverty when, in fact, people have different definitions of poverty? And in fact, I think this is one of the things that have made indigenous peoples or poor people more vulnerable. They're defined as poor, and suddenly that's their characteristic. They're just poor people, vulnerable people, and their agency and their own visions of who they are suddenly get lost in the process, right? So we started to talk about indicators relevant for indigenous peoples. If we are to provide additional indicators in the Millennium Development Goals, or even for the Sustainable Development Goals, what would be the indicators that we ourselves would define as characterizing our well-being or characterizing poverty? Yeah, so in that work, we organized a number of regional workshops. We did this work together with the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that was looking at the MDGs in relation to indigenous peoples. And also with the CBD, because the CBD at that time, and we had lobbied for this, started looking at indicators for traditional knowledge. Yeah. So we had these regional workshops, and we entitled them Indicators for Relevant for Indigenous Peoples for Well-Being and Sustainability. But the main purpose of those workshops were for the indigenous organizations themselves to define what are the domains of well-being. And also, if we were to look at traditional knowledge, what kinds of indicators would you actually put forward, right? Interestingly, and this surprised me, despite having these 5 global workshops across the world, the types of indicators on well-being were quite similar. We studied all of the small group reports, etc. And this actually got distilled into 12 main domains of well-being that indigenous peoples were putting forward, right? We can't go into those details, but I was surprised at the convergence for these domains. And then for the Convention on Biological Diversity, in addition to linguistic diversity, we had the status and trends on traditional occupations, what is happening really to traditional occupations and livelihoods. And then the other one was land use change and changes in land tenure in the territories of indigenous and local communities. Now, it was very hard for us to find data sets for this because governments are not collecting this information, or international bodies. So after a few years, we decided that our main approach would be a community-based monitoring approach, where we would actually develop tools that communities directly could use to monitor, yeah, what's happening to languages, to traditional occupations, etc. And these tools we piloted with some of our partners, and a number of very interesting reports came out of those studies. Right? So I was helping in the piloting work in the Philippines, but other partners were doing it in New Zealand, in other countries. But anyway, Pernilla said that one of the results of that work was that we published these local biodiversity outlooks. And this is containing a number of the reports by the communities themselves. They're the ones writing this, showing how they're actually contributing to each of the Aichi biodiversity targets of the strategic plan for biodiversity. Yeah, because parties had thought that because they had put target 18 to support traditional knowledge and customary sustainable use, they had done their bit for indigenous and local communities in the CBD. But we said no. Our contributions are cross-cutting all the targets, whether it is education and public awareness, it's valuation, it's protected areas, it's species protection. All of these other targets are actually relevant for indigenous peoples because we're living in those ecosystems and are actually managing biodiversity in a wide swathe of lands and territories across the world, right? Okay, I'll say one more experience, and then maybe we'll have a discussion. There is a very interesting tool now that we've been piloting and have started to use, and we want to extend its use. And it's called the Indigenous Navigator, right? You may be aware that the United Nations adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that there was a World Conference on Indigenous Peoples at the level of the General Assembly to see how well the rights of indigenous are actually being respected. So we've developed a tool. It's actually a questionnaire. There's a national level questionnaire and a community level questionnaire. But the framework is actually the International Human Rights Framework and human rights monitoring, because there's quite good guidance coming from the UN bodies on human rights for how you do human rights monitoring. So the communities, the organizations we were working with prioritized core rights within the international covenants and within the UN Declaration. And we opened that up into quite simple questionnaires. I'll give you an example. For example, education, right? The right to education has several components: accessibility, relevance, etc., right? Therefore, we put in our questionnaire for accessibility, how far is the elementary school from your community? Or is there a school in your community? Things like that. For relevance, is traditional knowledge taught there? Are any of your languages used? Anyway, we developed this quite simple questionnaire at two levels. The national questionnaire, which would assess how well governments in their laws, policies, and programs are actually putting attention to implementing indigenous rights. But the community questionnaire was the community's own judgment of how well governments were meeting these commitments and delivering on core commitments they've made in the SDGs or the MDGs and in the human rights instruments that they've signed. And what is the actual outcome, right? And we made web illustrations. This is the national outcome or result assessment. And what is the community assessment? So you can also make a comparison between how communities perceive they're actually enjoying those rights with how national law is already saying they are enjoying those rights, right? And a big issue is disaggregated data. We don't really have a lot of information from national statistics to inform these exercises, and so we're trying to collect a lot of the things we generate. The other thing that we've done recently, particularly in relation to IPBES, is that we've networked a lot of these organizations that have been doing community monitoring and work on knowledge into centers of distinction on indigenous and local knowledge. Yeah, we're trying to give greater visibility, but also greater institutionalization to these efforts. Because if you're looking at knowledge systems, science has all its institutions, bodies, universities, etc. They want to collaborate with indigenous and local knowledge. And where are we? We're all in our little organizations doing these little initiatives that we felt we needed some strength and institutionalization to support ourselves and our efforts, but also to increase the possibilities of interaction with other actors. So that's just a brief overview of some of the work that's been done, maybe through discussion, or we'll be able to open up some of the other issues that relate to this topic. Thanks very much.